It's good to see everybody tonight. Glad y'all are happy to see each other and visiting along the way. It's always wonderful to be together in the middle of the week, study the Word, and see each other's faces, and hopefully encourage each other in the process. We are studying in here the book of Revelation, the revelation of Jesus Christ as it is described in chapter 1. And, looking around the audience, I know most of you reasonably well, some of you really well, some of you not as well. And those of you I don't know as well, it could be that some of what Brian and I have covered so far has been kind of like over your head, and that's okay. I think as we, if you're not familiar with the book at all, in other words, if you're just new to this, you've never really studied Revelation before, you're not even familiar with much of the plot or the characters or images that show up, and or the history of the early church in the first century, I can see where you would feel kind of lost in what we've discussed so far. We're talking about, is it Nero, Domitian, Vespasian, who is this? And you're like, I don't know who any of those guys are. I think that as we get more and more into this, more and more of it will make sense. I'd encourage you just to persevere with us along the way. We're trying to, in these introductory classes, get our arms around some questions and hopefully set up a framework that will help us as we dive into the text in just a few more lessons. I'm particularly looking forward to my next talk on Wednesday night next week, in which we're going to do kind of a wide-angle view of the major narrative structures, maybe symbols used in the book. I feel much more at home in that than some of the other stuff that Brian's assigned me to do. But I'm really looking forward to that. But I'm looking forward to tonight's class as well. The assignment that I have is to look at the views of Revelation through the centuries. I spent quite a bit of time yesterday trying to comb through 2,000 years of church history and isolate what different groups thought at different times along the way. And after several hours of that, sort of had to abandon that because that's an impossible task in some ways, and I'm not sure it's exactly what Brian had in mind anyway. So what I have done is I've focused in on four major interpretations that people have taken to the book of Revelation through the centuries. And maybe as we look at these four major ways of interpreting the book, we can talk about how at different periods of time in church history, a particular view was more in vogue or has faded from view. So that's going to be the approach that I'll take. Before we jump in, Carrie, would you mind leading us in a word of prayer? One of the interesting things that I did learn, and I had kind of known this from previous studies about what we call the canon or the development of the canon of Scripture, how you define the boundaries of what is Scripture, the Word of God, out of all of the various writings through the centuries, how Christians have come to accept the 66 books of the Bible as this is the Word of God. And learning again that over the first 4 centuries that there was some conflict among church leaders as to whether Revelation belonged in that or not. And the best I could feel from spending quite a bit of time reading some of the literature is that those who kind of wanted to leave it out or minimize its significance in some way largely did so on the basis that there were a lot of people from early on that were taking Revelation and using it to come up with some really crazy ideas, some really heretical stuff. And I think some of the church leaders just said, the book's more trouble than it's worth. It's causing us a lot of issues because of the way some people are misinterpreting it. And so it's always been a difficult book to handle. But I think these four major views will help us maybe develop our own attitude toward it. And clarify some of the questions that we have. So just as a quick overview, we're going to look at each of these four major views rather quickly, and then we'll go back and go over them more slowly in some detail. The first that we'll talk about is the idealist view. And what's an idea? What is
The light bulb
ideation?
turns on in your head.
Yeah, it's a thought that pops up in your head. And you can have ideas that are not like necessarily connected to any specific concrete event or happening. It's just an idea that could be mapped onto any number of specific situations, right? And that's the idea of the idealist approach to Revelation, is that the writer is not talking about any particular historical events, but is a generalization of the way the forces of good and evil are always in conflict, and how the tensions between them tend to rise up over time and then find resolution. Some of that kind of idea is involved in the idealist event interpretation. The second is the futurist. And people who take this interpretive approach believe that the events recorded in Revelation are mostly yet to be fulfilled. And by yet to be fulfilled, I mean from our perspective right now here in this room tonight. They're looking at, not all usually, but many of the prophetic statements in this book have not yet been fulfilled, and that we're still waiting here in 2023 for the things that John wrote about to happen. And so that is in a bit of a simplification, but basically the futurist approach. The historicist approach or interpretive method sees it as events, these events unfold gradually from the time of its writing, when John wrote it, until the end of history. And so he's sort of laying out however many thousands of years there are between the time that John lived and the end of all things. However long that is, he's laying out the rope, sort of like unrolling a carpet, maybe unrolling a tapestry. And as it unrolls, you're getting different images of things that are going to happen along the way. And then there's the preterist view, which Brian and I have both talked about, and is the kind of the primary approach that we lean toward, we'll be taking in this class. And that's that most of the events, you can take a full preterist view and say all of the events. Brian and I, neither one take that view, but we would say most of the events that are described in the Revelation were fulfilled in the first century. Again, that's an oversimplification. At least on my part, it's an oversimplification, because I kind of tend to merge together the preterist and the idealist approaches a little bit in my approach, which we'll get to at the end. So those are the four basic approaches that people have taken to interpreting the book. Now let's go back and look at each of those in a little more detail. First, the idealist approach. Again, we sometimes use the word ideal to say, well, just that the ideal would be the way things would be if everything was just perfect. It's an ideal. That's really not the meaning of the word here. Think more of an idea as an abstract generalization about the struggle between good and evil. That's what the writer is trying to lay out for us. That John is showing us that, God and Satan, good and evil, are involved in a cosmic struggle that plays itself out in the theater of human events, and over time certain patterns reveal themselves over and over again with variations along the way. But this idea of how these two forces interact is largely the approach that the idealist would take. It would include that the book is symbolic of the church's experience of Christians or saints or the church's experience at all times. In other words, this isn't peculiar to first century Christians or third century Christians or 9th or 21st century Christians, but it sort of symbolizes the experience that all Christians have, whether in Judea, Asia Minor, Europe, North America, Africa, Australia, wherever you are, that it represents symbolically the struggle that all Christians have with the various forces of evil over time. It is perhaps the most non-literal, therefore, of all interpretive methods, if that makes sense. Again, because it's not trying to map onto a specific event, but again, give the idea of the struggle. So everything is more purely symbolic and abstract. It's meta truth. Okay, it's not saying these things aren't real or they're not true, but they're meta truths because they're true over and over again in all different situations and places and experiences of the church. This approach is not trying to crack the code, as it were. It's not looking for that one-to-one mapping on of the image that John uses and the event historically, or the person historically, or the beast with the number 666. The pure idealist wouldn't ask the question, who is that in history? But would see in it rather perhaps the idea of 666 is falling short of 7 over and over and over again. That this is the human attempt to try to be God, but falling short over and over again would be one way of them thinking of this, rather than trying to crack the code of how this maps onto some historical person. The idealist would see the purpose of the book is that of fortifying the church in every age to respond to evil in the way that Christ did, so that we may share in his victory. That's a sort of a composite of some quotes that I took from some people who hold the idealist position. And as a general takeaway, would you or would you not agree with the value of that purpose of the book?
And how we apply it.
Yeah, I think so. And how we apply it, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, as you say that, you see how really we could call pretty much all the New Testament for us more or less idealist. You know, we don't open up and go, well, you know, we're having a big controversy over whether we should eat meat or not.
Yeah.
But we try to draw from this generalizations that can be applicable in other periods.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so much of the specific issues that Christians were dealing with, whether eating meats or, hey, you know, this guy wants to be a member of our church, he's not circumcised, should we let him in or not? You know, to us, that's never a question. I've been a preacher and an elder and a member in churches all my life. I've never heard anybody struggle with that. But if you had been living in first century Judea, a member of the church at Jerusalem, this would have been the issue for the church to try to figure out, right? So that isn't the specific thing that we're dealing with, but there are ideas or principles that we can extract from that sort of conflict and struggle that we could apply in modern day settings, yes.
So when he talks about the 7 churches of Asia, how does an idealist look at that? Or is it just when it talks about the abstract language?
Yeah, I think that they would largely include the 7 churches, and these churches would represent different sorts of problems or characteristics that churches would typically find themselves facing over time. So again, and I think this is to Brian's point, we may not map on 1-to-1 with the church at Ephesus or Thyatira or hopefully Laodicea, but we can sort of take a composite of all these and look at ourselves and think, well, where do we fall under Christ's condemnation? Where do we meet his approval? What adjustments do we need to make? Not based necessarily, not because he's talking to the church at Lost River, but because we can abstract these principles. And so, in answer to your question, I don't know if, okay, let me back up and just put it this way. In all four of these models, there's a lot of variation. Some pure theoretical or idealist interpreters might say, no, these 7 churches are not even specific churches, but they just represent an idea. Others might say, well, that part of Revelation he is addressing specifically the church at Ephesus. So I wish I could tell you I was an expert on all of these views. I'm not. And again, there's a wide variety of ways that people would probably answer that question. It was a good question. Does it make sense, the answer?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Mealy mouthed answer.
Okay, well, we're gonna do a lot of circling around, answering questions in here, so
Yeah.
people should prep for that.
The futurist will be the second view, and that's that we're still waiting for most of the prophecies to be fulfilled. Again, tons of variation with this particular view. Most futurists would believe that there are parts of it that have already been fulfilled, but for the most part, these would be people who would say that the bulk of the prophecies in the book are something that we're still waiting to see happen. And this one is important for us to give some attention to tonight, because in the evangelical and fundamentalist world, this in America at least, this is probably still the prevailing view of the book of Revelation, and most of the folks you might talk to about the book or at the water cooler or wherever y'all have office discussions is likely to hold to some kind of a futurist view of the book, although it seems to me, I'm not out there all the time and knowing what's going on, but it seems to me that that's something that has kind of reached its zenith, and I think is moving back, in my opinion, in a much healthier direction. There are a lot of more mainstream evangelical commentators now who are abandoning the hyper premillennial, dispensational premillennialist futurist view, if all of that verbiage makes any sense to you. They would say that most of the prophecies of judgment are specifically, if you've read through the book, hopefully you have taken time to just read through the book, and you see there's a lot of dark stuff going on in the book. There's a lot of bad actors doing a lot of bad stuff, and a lot of people suffering. And the futurist view, for the most part, compresses all of that into what they call a 7-year period of tribulation that they believe will take place before the millennium, in which the view is that Christ will come and set up a literal 1,000-year reign on the earth. But prior to that, and depending on whether you're pre, mid, or post tribulation rapture believer, in this view, you would have a period of intense suffering that you would go through. Now, there's no mention of a 7-year period in the book. There are any number of mentions of 3.5 years, and they typically believe that these 3.5 years are 2 separate 3.5 years that go together, and that's where you get a lot of mid-tribulation rapture people, because they think that the rapture of the saints will happen in the middle of this. But at any rate, they believe that most of these events are things that are going to be leading up to a literal return of Christ, where he sets up a 1,000-year reign on the earth before the final judgment and the eternal state, and that we're still waiting for this 7-year period of tribulation to come. It claims to be the most literal interpretation I really think that that's a misnomer. It's actually just the most untethered, I think, in the sense that it, well, let me give you an example. I forgot about this. I've got the example here. Look at Revelation 9. And we'll just take the time to read a little bit here, get our appetites whetted for what's in store for us down the road. Revelation chapter 9, he says, "The fifth angel sounded his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from the sky to the earth. The star was given the key to the shaft of the abyss. When he opened the abyss, smoke rose from it like the smoke of a gigantic furnace. The sun and sky were darkened by smoke from the abyss, and out of the smoke, locusts came down upon the earth and were given power like that of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any plant or tree, but only those people who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They were not given power to kill them, but only to torture them for 5 months, and the agony they suffered was like that of the sting of a scorpion when it strikes a man. During those days, men will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will elude them. The locusts looked like horses prepared for battle. On their heads they wore something like crowns of gold. Their faces resembled human faces. The hair was like women's hair. Their teeth was like the teeth of lions. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the thundering of many horses and chariots rushing into battle. They had tails and stings like scorpions, and in their tails they had the power to torment people for 5 months." So, any interpretation, that sounds pretty bad. But a lot of futurist and premillennialist approaches to this say, well, our interpretation is very literal because we're going to tie this to some very literal and future events. And I took these pictures. They're not very good pictures, but I wanted to take them directly off of someone's website who was making this claim. And what he says is, that the locusts, which are like grasshoppers, the locusts, that actually refers to, I forget what kind of helicopter is it? Somebody know? Is that a what?
It's a Black Hawk.
A Black Hawk. Okay, it's a Black Hawk helicopter. That's what the locusts are referring to. And I wish I could have got these up side by side. They're, I kind of get it. There's some similarity there in how they look. And that the scorpions, that's scary, kind of look like, what kind of helicopter is that?
That's
Apache.
That's a Mi-24 Hint.
Okay. Well, it looks kind of like a scorpion.
Ask a silly question.
So, the appeal of all of this, and the reason I think that it has been so appealing to so many people in modern history is because it grabs our attention. It's now. Okay, these are the things that they're all the stuff we've been waiting for 2,000 years, but we're the people, and this is the time, and now this is about to happen, and that gets our radar up. There's a relevance realization when you feel like something is going to happen very specifically in your lifetime.
I have a coworker whose husband thinks that Jesus has already returned and we're in the times right before the 7-year tribulation. So would this be like that, a futurist view? Or does that fall into?
Yeah, I would definitely think that would be a futurist view. I haven't heard the twist of thinking that Jesus has already returned and is about to begin the tribulation or the
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
When she was telling me about it, because she disagrees, I was confused because I'd
Yeah.
never heard that before. So.
Yeah, I've never heard that particular twist, but like I say, there are so many different variations within these general frameworks, but that's one I haven't heard.
I heard this one time described as the newspaper exegesis.
Yes. Yes.
Current things pop up, and I remember one time, I was in high school, and I read an article about how the 4 locusts were actually the Beatles.
Okay, the Beatles, yes.
Describe their electrical cords and speakers again, and
Yes.
everything about them was the Beatles.
And, you appreciate people's imaginative abilities to map things on, but that's exactly right. It's like interpreting the Bible through the headlines. Watching the latest news and then going back and, oh, that looks like that. This has got to be it, and it's going according to the book. It's happening. We in Revelations now, because Gorbachev and Kissinger, I remember when I was a kid hearing somebody talk about how they were different characters that are in the book of Revelation, or maybe now it's Putin and whoever else, pick your good or bad guy, whether it's Trump or Biden, whatever, that they're in here somewhere. If you can, I guarantee you can find somebody who sees all of these current characters as specifically, the one that you can map on to Revelation. So that would be the futurist view. It's a rather modern view. Now the idea of the literal reign of Christ on earth goes all the way back. I think you can find it in Justin Martyr, early second century. But this very highly developed, what we call what's the word I'm looking for? Certain kind of premillennial view, a dispensational premillennial view, began in the 1830s with a preacher by the name of John Darby, popularized by C.I. Scofield. Some of you may have had Scofield study Bibles. You read his notes in Revelation, you'll know exactly what all this is about. It's proliferated through the Dallas Theological Seminary, which was really well known for holding this position and training lots and lots of preachers to go out and advocate for it. And it became eventually the dominant view among evangelicals and fundamentalist groups in the 20th century. All right, so that's the futurist view. Let's move on to the historicist view, which is pretty interesting to me in a lot of ways. I don't buy it, but I can see where people would. And it interprets Revelation as predicting the church's history from the first century to the end of time. Like I used earlier, the rolling of the carpet of the tapestry out. And as you go through the centuries, you see where it's happening. So it's sort of a mix between the preterist view that was mostly fulfilled in the first century and the futurist view that's like, well, we're still waiting on it to begin to be fulfilled. And this one's like, no, it's started being fulfilled in the first century and it's gradually being unrolled all through the centuries. One of the examples of that, for instance, would be, and again, not all historicists would argue this point, but many of them would believe or teach that the 7 churches of Asia actually represent the 7 epochs or eras of church history. Ephesus maybe would represent the early church, the first few centuries of the church. And again, I don't know specifically the details of this interpretation, but that would be the early church. Then the church at Smyrna maybe would be the, after the post-Nicene era. And then, early Middle Ages would be Pergamum, and on it would go until you reach the 7th church, which would be the last era of the church before Christ comes. And so each of these represents an epoch of the church. I decided to use this as an example because we've already read the text of the locust horde that rises up out of the abyss. Most of the historicists would argue, at least at some point in the past, they argued that would have represented the rise of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries when they made their big push westward all the way into Europe. And that's we're at that point in the story now. The beasts would most often be viewed as the papacy, the popes, particularly as they're allied with the power of the state. I saw that many of them would argue that 3.5 years common period of time referenced throughout the book, is also equivalent to the 1,260 days, so 3.5 years is 1,260 days, which is mentioned in the book, or 42 months, which is basically the same time frame, that equals the 1,260 years of papal authority from the 6th century up into the 19th century. This view is really pretty rare today, at least in my experience. However, many Seventh-day Adventists still advocate for this position. And interestingly, they would say that the mark of, just while we're on the Adventists, the mark of the beast represents a time when people will be forced to worship on Sunday instead of Saturday. And so if you give way to that, then you're worshiping the beast. So, and that ties in with the popes who, according to them, changed the time of worship from Saturday to Sunday. Yeah.
I think this may be an idealist viewpoint, but there's a number of places in Scripture where a individual goes behind the veil and sees things from the spiritual realm. Paul does that in 2 Corinthians, I think. You also see that in Exodus when Moses approaches the Lord on top of Mount Sinai, and the 7-day creation, where you're seeing things from above, like a God's eye view.
Yeah.
And I think there's a problem that when you try to make things align, when the people are on the other side of the veil, they're trying to describe in human words what they're seeing. You get these weird, bizarre images like people with heads and scorpion tails and riders on horses and things like that, where it just doesn't make any sense. It's not like you could try to make it match something historical, but you also realize that, kind of like the book of Psalms, they made sense for David to say those words and also for Christ to say those words, but also for us to say those words. And it's like, which is it? It's like, well, God's not limited the way that we are. It's the same spirit that's in David that was also in Christ that's also in us. And it's like, when you go through something like a global pandemic, you can say, well, does this match something in the book of Revelation? I don't know, but it sort of feels like something in Revelation. It's like there's something spiritual happening here that I can't really explain. And I have a feeling that when you try to be, if we try, this might be an idealist viewpoint, you can tell me if it matches one of these categories. It doesn't feel like it does. But when you're taking God's eye view of history, there's a really powerful feeling that he's just seeing this completely different than we are. And that if we could see things from his point of view, it would look bizarre and strange and really hard to describe. And I don't know, I'm a little bit skeptical, and I don't want to knock you off course, but when people try to get too tidy with saying, well, this represents that, and this is Nero, and this is, the 4 horsemen, or blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, I have a feeling God's seeing something a little more colorful than that.
Yeah. I think you make some really good points, and I think that does tie in to some extent with a idealist viewpoint, which, if I get to it in the class, I sort of have sort of a hybrid idealist preterist view of things with a little bit of futurist maybe thrown in, but for good measure. But clearly one of the things of all these passages you cite, Isaiah, 6 as well, when he has the throne scene, he saw the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and he has that amazing throne vision. Other places where the veil, as you put it, is pulled apart. Of course, John is doing that, and what they see, they try to describe to us. But even there, sometimes wonder if what's being shown them is the ultimate heavenly reality itself, or still the heavenly vision or perspective that Jesus, or in this case, is wanting to project for them to have a more heavenly perspective of her earthly reality. And for instance, John says he sees Jesus in chapter 1, and he has 7 eyes, 7 horns, I think, 7 horns. Somebody can check me on that. I think it's 7 horns. I know it's 7 eyes. And, does that mean, okay, well, when the day comes and, I see the Lord face to face, wow, he's going to have 7 eyes. Well, I hope not. I mean, that would freak me out. But what does 7 eyes mean?
Complete vision.
Yeah, it's complete vision, it's knowledge, it's wisdom, it's, you know, all of, some of those omniscience, those kinds of things are represented by 7 eyes, 7 horns. What's a horn on an animal do? Yeah, it's power, right? And if you've got 7 of them, you're really powerful. I don't think that means that Jesus, like, I think when we see Jesus, we are going to see the glorified man, the glorified Son of Man. He's not going to be like half lamb, half lion with 7 eyes and 7 horns and some really freaky looking thing. He is a glorified man, but all of these symbolically are revealed to John to see him in ways that he can relate to us, that show us that Jesus sees and he has power. So if that's helpful, I don't know. Let's try to keep on going to the 4th view here, which is preterist. The preter is just the Latin word for past, so you could call this pastist if that helps you, as opposed to futurist, who's still waiting on all this to start and happen. This is the view that at least one iteration of the ideal has already occurred in the past. So the prophecies were future relative to John's original audience. In other words, it wasn't past from John's perspective or the people that originally received the letter, but it is past from our point of view today, in my view, with the exception of the closing few chapters. Now, much of the book deals with the 3.5 period, a year period of the Jewish and Roman war between 66 and 70 AD. I believe that this view has certain advantages, and while I agree with what you said about sometimes there, I think, is, even with the preterist view, too much effort at trying to work out every detail and map everything on, and I don't have always full confidence that we can do that as well as we would like to think we can. But it does have the advantage of, first of all, yielding the most meaning to its original audience. That it, as Brian has been at pains to emphasize, John was writing to real people in a real situation, and they really needed help. These were new. The church was brand new. These were, beginnings of the church, of Christianity, and they were really starting to undergo some intense opposition, had been, and we're about to undergo more. And writing about these things, I think, had a particular application and meaning to its original audience. I think it is the most tethered to known historical events, and therefore requires the least amount of speculation. We're not going to be getting into, this kind of helicopter sort of really looks like a locust, and that kind of far-fetched stuff that we know historically that does map on really well to what John says is revealed to him. Thirdly, its time frame fits the time frame given by John himself. Again, chapter 1, verse 1, verse 3, chapter 22, verse 6. These things are close at hand, near at hand. The time is near. It certainly, you don't have to try to explain away what those mean by this interpretive approach. And then, ironically, this tethering also helps us most clearly see the spiritual patterns that Ian's talking about that I think repeat through history. So this is where I sort of merge together the idealist and the preterist view. To me, it's not that the significance of a particular symbol is exhausted in a first century historical setting, but that it shows us an instance of how that works. That therefore, once you've mapped that correctly, are in a best position to apply it again as a similar pattern develops down the road. Now, it won't be exactly the same thing. History never repeats itself in exactly the same way. But certainly there are patterns that repeat themselves. And if we tether what actually happened to these Christians in the first century to the things that John says, I think we're in the best position to abstract that meaning out of it and reapply it to whatever circumstance we're facing today.
Yeah, it seems like God's law is a case law system, and you can't apply the case, and you can't apply the law unless you understand the case.
Yeah.
So if you get untethered from if you don't know what circumcision is, and you just start applying things randomly in an idealistic, who knows what you end up with. So you got to understand the case first.
Okay. Very, very good.
Lawrence?
Yes.
I think there's a telltale, though, that when you're, in my point of view, when you're seeing things sort of in the spiritual realm, the language is always really, really colorful in the Bible. It's always really colorful, almost bizarre. But it seems like Revelation is clearly, in fact, I think John says that I was in the Spirit or something. And then Ezekiel sort of says that a number of times, and Ezekiel is one of the most colorful books in the entire Bible. I think that's worth noting.
Again, I think you're 100% right on so much of this and for them and for us is that things are not what they seem. Things are not as they always appear to us from our bottom side perspective, that there is another level of reality that we need to appreciate and see through John's experience is going on.
Yeah, I think following on that, I think saying that, all of these references to visions in the Old Testament, some of which are quite bizarre, others not so much so, but still fantastic in their presentation, doesn't mean those things were not tethered to real events. The coming of Christ, the death of Christ, the messiahship of Christ. I mean, those are all of these things we're talking about, Isaiah, Ezekiel, these others, it's not as though he was just, oh, here's some grand vision. I mean, we do have to understand, some of these things are there, just like in Jesus' parables, to carry forward the vision. Doesn't mean everything has a direct mapping, much less a literal mapping. But saying that and seeing the epicness and the grandness of it doesn't mean that there is a total disconnect with real events.
Yeah. Well put.
If there's a total disconnect, then it has no use for us.
Right.
Yeah, so for me, the correct view of all this, I know y'all been waiting for this, is primarily a preterist view. That these events were describing things that happened, had at least an instantiation in first century, but that I think to Ian's point that they're often revealed to us from a heavenly spiritual point of view that it contains a seed, a principle, an idea that can be reapplied in similar situations outside of that original context or fulfillment, and that there are elements of the book, particularly toward the end, that even have some specific reference, I think, to things yet to happen. So there's a quick overview then of the four main views of Revelation through the years. One thing we haven't talked about a lot that I didn't get into was specific, a little bit about the futurist, but the 1,000-year, the millennial reign, and all of these views have some idea about what that means. And I know as we get into that part of the book, we'll talk about that in some detail. Thank you guys for your good attention and comments tonight.